Welcome to America's premier forum on the National Flood Insurance Program. Hi, I'm Rich Slevin with H2O Partners, FEMA's training contractor for the NFIP. And today's topic is the new 2-year Preferred Risk Policy Eligibility Extension that just went into effect January 1st of 2011. And we're going to specifically focus on its effect on lending institutions. Now, the first thing we need to do is to define just what a preferred risk policy is. The preferred risk policy, or PRP, is the NFIP's simplified, low-cost approach to writing flood insurance. It typically applies to buildings outside of special flood hazard areas in flood zones B, C, and X only. But FEMA recognizes the financial burden that recent flood map changes have placed on certain property owners. As a result, it's developed the 2-year PRP eligibility extension to address the financial burden of mandatory purchase requirements on policyholders in these newly mapped areas. So buildings newly designated within a special flood hazard area due to a map change on or after October 1st of 2008, they're eligible for coverage under the low-cost preferred risk policy for a period of up to 2 years, provided they meet the required loss history requirements. Now, when it comes to use of the 2-year PRP eligibility extension, property owners have 2 windows of opportunity. The first applies to buildings that were newly designated within a special flood hazard area due to a map revision on or after October 1st of 2008 and before January 1 of 2011. They're now eligible for a PRP for a period of up to 2 policy years. The second window of opportunity applies to buildings that are newly designated within a special flood hazard area due to a map revision on or after January 1st of 2011. And they'll be eligible for a PRP for up to 2 policy years from the effective date of that map revision whenever it occurs. So the question becomes, how does the PRP extension affect lenders? Well, first you should understand that insurance carriers, not lending institutions, are the ones that have to validate eligibility for the PRP extension. But effective October 1 of 2010, NFIP declarations pages began displaying 2 flood zones, one called the current flood zone and the other called the flood risk or rated zone, to help lending institutions identify when the 2-year PRP eligibility extension applied. Now, the current flood zone is simply the flood zone of the property on the current or revised flood insurance rate map. In other words, what flood zone is the building in right now? The flood risk or rated zone is the flood zone from the previous map used to rate the policy. Now, lenders are not required to investigate or even resolve differences between the current flood zone and the flood risk rated zone. In fact, their primary focus should be on the current flood zone. Does their flood zone determination match the current flood zone as it's displayed on the deck page? Let's take a look at a declarations page that shows both of those flood zones. In our example here, we see a rated zone of B and a current zone of AE. So as I just said, the lender's focus should be on the current zone. Does their standard flood hazard determination form match the current zone of AE? If it does, there is no flood zone discrepancy to be resolved. The rated zone of B in this case would simply be a byproduct of the use of the 2-year PRP eligibility extension, or perhaps the grandfather rule, using, for rating purposes, the flood zone from a prior flood map. Now, speaking of the grandfather rating rule, the grandfathering indicator will continue to appear on deck pages indicating whether the policy has been grandfathered or not. So to summarize, lending institutions may see rating changes in their borrowers' policies as a result of the application of the 2-year PRP eligibility extension, but their focus should be on whether their determination matches the current flood zone as it's displayed on the deck page. I'm Rich Slevin, and that's how the 2-year PRP eligibility extension affects lenders.